Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode we have a conversation with a contemporary thinker on issues of architecture and design thinking. We're interested broadly in architecture, on what it has been, what it is, but most importantly on what it might be, what it could be in the future. Today I am very lucky and happy to be in the study of Professor Dominick LaCapra, who is Professor Emeritus of Intellectual History from Cornell University, and now is living in Santa Fe. Dominick, of course, doesn't require much introduction. He has done an extensive body of work. Most specifically, I would like to bring up his rethinking of the methods and modalities of intellectual history, influenced by post-structuralism, French critical theory, and over the last decade and a half or so, his work, of course, on trauma and the Holocaust and the associated issues with that. But today we'll try and see where the conversation takes us and cover a variety of topics, but we are inspired in particular by his new upcoming book, which deals with a variety of issues, but seems to be organized around the idea of transference. So welcome to Architecture Talk, Dominick.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here.
So Dominick, yes, of course, you have had a long association at Cornell working with architecture faculty and students over the years. But I thought transference would be a very interesting topic to discuss today. And I read in the brief of your book the idea that transference, of course, is an important process, is not only in psychoanalysis, but in a sense in daily life, in our interactions with other people, with other objects, with animals, and so on. And it seemed to me what you were saying was that transference is unavoidable and in a sense almost necessary to thinking about important things like empathy and love. Is this true? Is this what you're trying to suggest?
That's what I'm trying to argue. I think that in psychoanalysis, Freud indicated this in his autobiographical study, that transference was intensified in the analytic situation, but it's something that characterized all of life, and in fact, he says, all of human beings' relationship to the environment, which is quite interesting. He never developed that idea, and I think that in psychoanalysis, transference is seen in terms of the parent-child relationship and the displacement of the parent-child relationship onto other relationships, significantly the relationship between the analysand and the analyst, so that you at times have a replication, or always have a replication, of the parent-child relationship in the relationship between doctor and patient. And I think this is true in all of medicine, as Freud did, and that he believes that it is both the greatest resistance to a cure or to improvement and the best aid in that. Now, I try to go about it from the other end. And he also developed, of course, the concept of countertransference. When the analyst has a relationship to the analysand or the patient. I try to eliminate these concepts because I think that...
to eliminate the concept?
In terms of transference, countertransference. Countertransference gives you the impression that first there is a transference from the patient to the doctor, and then there's something that is generated that goes in the other direction, which I think is a little bit misleading. It starts by placing the analyst in a position of superiority, as if the analyst is not always implicated in the relationship, and the analyst is. So I simply talk in general about transferential relations in terms of a mutual implication of self and other, a mutual implication which is nonetheless skewed in certain directions, because the person with greater power has in some sense a manifestly greater influence on the other, although the reverse also has a certain power. And it's very interesting that I've confronted, especially among historians, a great deal of resistance to this notion of transference as mutual implication with a tendency to repeat.
Right.
That qualifies whatever one does in terms of scholarship. The thing that I've stressed and explored to some extent is the way in which the problems you treat tend to be replicated in some disguised way in your own treatment of them.
Right.
Not simply as an object,
right.
but as a force working over your own thought.
So this is between two people, let's say, but you talk about the tendency, transference across time, transference across the object that you're studying, transference. You mentioned animals.
Yes.
What are you trying to drive at there?
That, I think that our relationship to others, what is often called animism in earlier anthropology, or in terms of projection.
Right.
And I think that there are elements of projection and incorporation in transference. Also, participant observation in anthropology, which is, many anthropologists believe that it is simply one method that should be avoided in a scientific anthropology. But I think participant observation is simply the form transference takes in the relationship between the anthropologist and the people the anthropologist is studying.
I see.
And one of the people I talk about in which this is blatantly manifest is a man named Frank Hamilton Cushing. So he went to Zuni and wound up staying in Zuni for almost 4 years. And he is an interesting, still controversial figure among the Zuni and among native populations in general. He moved into the house of the headman or governor, as they translate it, and he couldn't be thrown out because of the rules of hospitality.
I see.
They didn't want him around.
Right.
He hung around, and ultimately the governor really liked him and virtually adopted him.
Right.
And he pretty much became a member of the tribe. Inducted into its most prestigious religious association, and doing rites of initiation, including scalping a member of another tribe. So this is someone who, in the vernacular, quote unquote, went native.
Right.
He really carried transference to the point of identification. He wanted to be a Zuni. And dressed up in regalia, which he thought was looking Zuni, and in certain ways it was, and in certain ways it went beyond that to a kind of hyperbolic manifestation of self. But he is an interesting figure for me in that regard because of the way in which he, in a sense, acted out transference towards this people.
Okay.
And in a way became one of them. And that's the extreme. Many people see transference or even empathy as a form of identification.
So how do we distinguish? How do we know when this is identification gone too far, and when is it a more sort of a critical or sort of a more, I don't know if the phrase is worked through relationship, when is it an empathetic relationship and when is it not? How does one know?
Well, I think, in a sense it is empathy in a more positive sense. When the person involved, let's say with this anthropologist,
right,
may well participate in the rituals, take them very seriously, even find a concern and even a commitment to the religious beliefs, but doesn't believe he has become the other. That there is always a notion that you are not the other, and there's always a kind of difference between you and the other, which leads you to respect certain things. Now, where Cushing went over the line, I think, and many people, would share this for different reasons, is when he did things like take notes or make sketches during the religious ceremonies. And this was manifestly sacrilegious for the Zuni people.
I see.
Evidenced in the fact that they almost killed him at those points. So,
right.
He did cross a certain line there. And he's a fascinating character for a lot of different reasons. But the more general thing about transference is that it can relate to animals and objects, even architecture, like houses.
Yes.
In terms of animals, for me, I when I go to a new place, I like to visit the local cemetery.
Okay.
And walk around, look at the names, see the way in which there's a certain arrangement. You may not know this, but there's a cemetery in Ithaca along Cascadilla Park. It's an old cemetery, only active now for veterans, but no longer really in use. But the section of the cemetery for Jews is segregated by a chain, which they've left there. And in a way, this cemetery is a good and almost reflection of the structure of the town. What's amazing for me is how many people are buried with their quote-unquote pets, their dogs or even their cats. That many, many mortuary sites have the people and the animal buried in very close proximity, indicating that the animal is a member of the family.
Right.
And they're buried with that being.
Right.
And that's fascinating. Also in terms of houses, structures you've lived in, you either have a positive or a negative transference to a place.
Right.
There are certain places you immediately don't like. You're not sure why you don't like them. You may have reasons, too claustrophobic, not enough light, whatever, but you're not exactly sure. Another very interesting fact that realtors will still tell you is that if it is known that someone was killed in a house, it is very hard to sell that house.
Right.
People are still somehow, quote unquote, superstitious about the ghosts that haunt the house. And we'll get back to the ghost, which is an interesting phenomenon here. But on the other hand, you have a very, very positive affection for a house.
Yes.
And not want to leave it. And what's sort of fascinating is that this kind of transferential investment in property is something that cuts against the grain of capitalism.
I'm very excited you're going straight to the house. But first I want to spend a little bit more time with animals and people's pets and that transference. And try and parse that, in terms of what you were saying earlier, as when that kind of transference is, empathetic, and when is it fetishistic, and when is it possibly even substitutional. Sometimes I feel that people will affect a significant love for their own pet while turning a complete blind eye to the massive slaughter of animals that goes on in the food meat production industry.
Well, right. I mean, there's both a hierarchy between what could more generally be called, and I tend to call domestic companion animals, and animals that are produced for food.
Right.
And there is that very, very strong dichotomy. It's also interesting that farmers who know that an animal is going to be slaughtered never give that animal a name.
Right.
That's the unnamed animal.
Yes.
Whereas the animal that's not going to be killed gets a name.
Yes.
And of course, all domestic animals we name. And
so how do we parse that? How do you parse that? So by naming, is that empathy? Or what is it?
Well, it's empathy for, in some cases, verging on love for the animal.
Right.
And it means that they have been embraced, accepted in a certain way. And it's a form of dissociation between the domestic animal and the animal in a factory. Most people don't want to know what factory farms look like. They don't want to know what slaughterhouses look like.
Right.
And at times you can understand that because these people may be extremely sensitive and they get recurrent nightmares if they see these things.
Right.
And it has a very severe effect on them. In other cases, it's the development of a certain kind of hardness. And here you make a little leap. It is a bit of a leap of the imagination to someone like Himmler.
Himmler, you mean in the Third Reich?
Third Reich Himmler.
Yeah.
Himmler, interesting, strange being, who, of course, was in charge of the entire SS and the Gestapo, and oversaw the killing of the Jews.
Right.
On the other hand, he was a vegetarian and very much respected animals and tried to further legislation in Germany to protect animals. Himmler, as was well known, suffered from incapacitating stomach cramps.
I see.
Incapacitating stomach cramps, which would lay him out for 4 or 5 days, and he couldn't move. He was in excruciating pain. And this Felix Kirsten very plausibly hypothesizes that they were psychosomatic in origin. There was no physical reason for these cramps. But there was a kind of, I think, dual impact of events on Himmler. The first and probably the most important was his view of Hitler almost as a hidden god. Well, okay, that was
hidden god.
that was the voice of the man above. But Himmler pretty much worshipped Hitler and thought that Hitler was a savior figure, that he had come to save Germany. And in any manifest way, Himmler could never oppose Hitler, although he did in certain ways at the end of the war. So his anxiety about what Hitler would think about what he was doing was one of the things that caused extreme stress in Himmler. Mm-hmm. I think a second thing is that he initially didn't want to kill the Jews, he wanted to expel them.
Right.
He wanted, not have them immigrate, get them all to go out.
Yeah.
But he didn't want to kill them, and he had to swallow that.
Yeah.
And I think it never really sat well with him. He was still very uneasy about having done this, and you can see this. Kirsten has a book of his conversations with him, which is very interesting to read, in that it does reveal things, I think, that are to be taken seriously.
So shorthand, connect the animals and the vegetarianism to his stomach cramps, to his role in the Holocaust.
Well, it's sort of extrapolating from the idea that you can dissociate between people and animals, mm-hmm. and the animals may become an object of displacement for your affections when you were doing horrible things to people. Also true in England in the 19th century, that people who were rabid capitalists, extremely exploitative of their workers, adored their pets. And the little lapdog that always followed people around. That can happen. That certainly can happen, that form of dissociation, but obviously it's not necessary. You can have, what you can have instead is what I would forward, that is, say, a critique of anthropocentrism and of human exceptionalism, that we are in fact animals.
That's right.
Animals with certain abilities, certain disabilities, can do things certain animals can't do, and we can't do things other animals can do. One fact I love, since I swim, is that the average fish can swim 35 miles an hour. And the fastest human in the world can swim maybe about 5 miles an hour.
Even Michael Phelps.
That's right.
That's very interesting. We are here with Dominick LaCapra, and we are having a conversation on transference and its role in a variety of fields, from animals to architecture to interpersonal relationships to the Third Reich. And I'm sure we'll continue on in this vein. Welcome back to Architecture Talk. We are talking to Dominick LaCapra. So Dominick, we were starting to talk about, as we were discussing animals and Himmler, about the critical difference in one's ability to maintain, I guess the term would be, some kind of a critical distance, or some kind of a distance between one's own sense of self and the other, while using a certain kind of modality of transference to develop empathy and engagement with the other.
Very much.
That process can, of course, work in the manner of displacement, where you project onto animals things that you are potentially repressing or suppressing other places, in which case it potentially shows up as some kind of a symptom, as you were beginning to describe in the case of Himmler and his stomach cramps and so on. But more effectively, it shows up as self-critique. Yeah, I think you were starting to say that it becomes an opportunity in the best circumstance to develop a critique of anthropocentrism, let's say.
Yes, and also, that's the more general thing, which we'll come back to. The one other thing that I would add as a footnote to what we were saying earlier is that very often identification with the other may induce a certain kind of intrusiveness in questioning the other or in relating to the other.
Right.
Because in a way you think you're relating to yourself. And so you permit yourself things that really cross certain boundaries when you're dealing with another person. Is in Claudelandsman, in what is undoubtedly his unbelievably significant film Shoah, when he questions certain people. And he has 3 films: Why Israel? No question mark, he insists. Why Israel? Why Israel should exist. The second one is Shoah. And the third one is Tzahal, on the Israeli Defense Force, which was made in the 80s and was a kind of celebratory presentation of the Israeli Defense Force. And the film, amazingly enough, structurally has important analogies to Shoah, in that the tank takes the place of the train, but you have very, very similar movements visually. But in any case, in Shoah, he at times will question perpetrators in a very, very harsh and aggressive way, and even, as he says himself, lie to them without any feeling of remorse whatsoever, insofar as he wants to get certain things out of them which they wouldn't give otherwise.
I see.
And there's one man who he interviews, Suco Mel, who was at Treblinka, with a hidden camera. And he records everything, and the guy assures the guy that, he's not going to talk about this to anyone, and all the time he's recording him. And he did this with another former SS man who realized that, and he was severely beaten and hospitalized for a number of weeks. So he took risks with this technique.
Right.
But in any case, with victims, at times the techniques of questioning are very similar. And in the case of the victim, with the perpetrator, he has a very, very, very negative transference block.
Right.
And he even argues that you should not try to understand the perpetrator. You cannot understand the Nazi, and you shouldn't try to understand the Nazi. Trying to understand is an obscenity.
Right.
With respect to the victim, no. He, in a way, is so empathetic towards the victim that he identifies. But what it leads him to do at times is to pose questions that are virtually inquisitorial. And I think this is especially true of this former barber at Treblinka, Abraham Bomba, where they're in an exchange, and he's asking Bomba, well, how was it there, cutting their hair before they went into the gas chamber, when these women coming from your village, and you knew them? What did it feel like? And he actually has Bomba in a rented barbershop, which the viewer doesn't know, cutting the hair of people as he's asking him these questions. And at one point, Bomba breaks down and he says, look, I can't go on. I can't talk about this anymore. And Landsman says, no, we must go on. We must go on. And Bomba says something in Yiddish, which you don't understand, which I'm sure was not totally flattering. And then he says, okay, we'll go on.
Right.
But that's a point at which the absence of any sense of distance towards the other, with whom you very much empathize, leads to doing things that I think are ethically questionable. And many people who see that film don't even recognize this, because it is so much an invitation to participation.
That's right. It sort of helps them verify their own expectation of what they want to see and hear.
Yes.
And that, in a sense, plays to audiences.
Right. And I think also, and I think this is true, some people have almost said this, that for them, viewing this film is almost like a ritual, especially a ritual of mourning. There's a little essay by a person whose work I very much respect, entitled Shoah as Shiva, that is, say, Shoah as the Jewish ritual of mourning. That watching it is actually mourning for the Jews of Europe. And I can see that. And if once you recognize that you're seeing it as a ritual and that you cannot do certain things with it critically, that's fine. But that doesn't mean that you simply eliminate the possibility of a certain form of critique, which is not really an aggressive or a dismissive critique, but is pointing out certain things about certain mechanisms, analytic mechanisms that you may not be entirely aware of. So that's one reason for the distance, I think, is that you have a certain respect for the other who is not yourself, which in a way you may respect yourself, but there are certain ways in which you can see yourself or even berate yourself that you would not want to have applied to other people.
Right, right. So, for instance, there's a discussion, very casual, not so sort of deeply considered discussion as in the area that you work in, on the architecture and design of the concentration camps and the gas chambers. And there's an identified firm in Berlin whose name I can't remember right now.
Well, there was Siemens and Topf.
Yes.
Topf was the one that made the ovens. Understanding the Nazi constructions is not that difficult a problem, and it's a very long history, but there's a good book by Deborah Dwork and her collaborator on Auschwitz, and the way in which Auschwitz was first conceived by Himmler and others as a utopia, because what the Nazis... Utopia. The Nazis wanted to resettle ethnic Germans in portions of Poland and the East. And Auschwitz was at one point conceived of as a possible installation that would have utopian connotations. Then, of course, it became something very, very different, but still posed certain problems in construction, as did the other camps. I mean, it's very interesting. Now everybody distinguishes between concentration camps and death camps, that there were a handful of camps built for killing that posed specific architectural problems, in contrast to the work camps where the idea was to work people to death.
Right.
You know, if they died, they were disposable, but it wasn't, the construction was not made for death. But since they were often overworked, the distinction is not a foolproof distinction.
Right.
But it is interesting, there were a handful of camps, Helmno, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Belchek, that were exclusively death camps. And Auschwitz was half a work camp. Auschwitz-Monowitz was the work camp, and Auschwitz-Birkenau was the death camp. And the death camp, you know, you didn't have to have facilities for keeping these people around too much. They got off.
Right.
The selection was made. Some were sent to the work camp, and the others were killed virtually immediately.
Right. Right.
And you have, you know.
So you can sort of see those as sort of connected two parts of the same overall system. But let me return back to this very interesting and shocking, but perhaps not surprising thing, that there is a utopic, symmetry between, I suppose, the extreme efficiency of a death camp or even a working camp and the idea of utopia. And the physically, I'm talking very specifically physically. Right. Utopia is, in a sense, an architectural concept. And, you know, conceiving utopic communities three-dimensionally was a key part of the whole thing. Right?
Yes.
And in many ways, modern architecture, with its extreme interest in efficiency, rationalization, and a materialistic understanding of the prosperity and well-being of human beings as measured through hygiene and ergonomics, is criticized for being, well, I'm going to be hyperbolic and say death camp utopic.
Right.
Would you...
glass and steel.
Yes.
The glass and steel, you know, take Bentham's Panopticon, which Foucault wrote about, but a lot of other people did too.
Yeah.
And the structure of the Panopticon was very interesting in that it was a high tower, like a Trump Tower, into which there could be observation inwards but not outwards.
Right.
And it became, and Bentham, this was Bentham's great project. This was, you know, he has something on the Panopticon, also a little book defending himself, entitled something like, you know, an account of the war of Jeremy Bentham and George III, you know, his adversary as king. But Bentham really proposed the Panopticon not only as a prison, but as the model for all industrial architecture.
Right.
Workplaces.
That's right.
And he tried to promote it to the French National Assembly during the French Revolution.
Right.
That almost accepted it.
Yes,
But then drew back.
That's right.
Yeah.
And one can argue, I mean, that after World War II, the brakes were put on all the modernists because basically they saw that, in a sense, the entire architecture of rationalization and efficiency that they were so happily touting could be used in such a devastating manner.
Right.
But was not, of course, reason then to return to a sort of a simple historicist postmodernism, which was part of the response that came to be. Modernism got stuck, I would argue, wasn't able to negotiate this difficult project of keeping, critically engaging the system and yet maintaining a certain distance from it as the objective of a modernist work. You said earlier, I'm not sure how we can move this into that discussion, but Habermas's project is also, in a sense, how to retain the rational modernist project and yet try and maintain a certain kind of I don't know what the word would be, humanity to it.
Kind of utopian humanism.
Yes. Can this be connected to discussion of transference in some way?
In a way, I mean, again, it's a complicated issue. The way in which massive ideological and cultural formations are coded in one way or the other often depends very much on context. And I think it's interesting to see what the motivation of people like Le Corbusier was, and the extent to which he had rather far-right views at times that were combined with utopian ideas of garden cities and what have you. And that's sort of eerie. And the way in which modernism had various kinds of connections with different developments. And also postmodernism. I mean, for me, the slogan of modernism was "Make it new," and of postmodernism, everything old is new again. Right. But I think people, I think some people have become conscious of this and wary of this. It's and what it means for you. It is interesting. One criticizes the argument from authority, and yet where something is coming from, and what mouth says it, in certain ways matters.
Right, of course. And the context in which it is said and what is meant. So I completely agree with that, and that's true. But, where architecture has found itself is almost entirely disassociated from the social project, where architecture is no longer, actively engaged as a social project of making better societies. It's sort of retreated into an aestheticism, which I think is a loss.
I think so too. I think that there's still something in Ruskin and Morris, and I think certain other contemporary or near contemporary theorists like Colin Rowe, the idea of a collage city was a city in a way on the human level, rather than something filled with Trump towers and astronomical skyscrapers, glass and steel, and also interesting the contrast that Lévi-Strauss drew and became very influential for a while between engineering and bricolage collage. And the engineering mentality was that you had a certain goal, you erased everything, and you started from scratch, bringing in material to realize your goal.
Right.
And the opposite is bricolage, where you collect things along the way and then put them together in a manner that more or less goes together. And people like Morris would argue that it was crazy to try to superimpose on a 15th century cathedral your own idea of what an authentic 13th century tower would look like.
Right.
And he argued that there was a kind of way in which things went together, quote unquote, organically over time, even if they were initially ill-assorted. Right. And I think there is something to that. The one thing that struck me here is, in terms of like the critique of foundationalism, which is very prevalent, that there is an absence of absolute foundations.
Yeah.
I take that very seriously, and I also don't think there is much the concept of the quasi-transcendental, which Habermas still affirms. He argues that there are certain things which are quasi-transcendental. I think you could argue that you could provide good grounds and reasons for things in the absence of absolute foundations.
Sure.
And the material I like to see as, in a way, analogous to that is Adobe.
Really?
Adobe, yes, which
Adobe.
It's a form of mud. And it's mud held together by straw, at times even manure.
Yeah, of course.
And it's never more than 4 or 5 stories high. It stays on the non-transcendental level.
Right. An essay, like Adobe is like an essay, like a try, you sort of do it and you constantly repair it, but it's never finished.
And it's very Beckettian in that it's basically mud. You're messing around in mud all the time.
That's right. So what would be a mud city? I mean...
well, Santa Fe is a mud city, and many cities in the Southwest are mud cities.
Right. But conceptually, can we parse this into a mud city? So Colin Rowe sort of made this... like this Freudian vision of the collage city as this multi-layered place with simultaneity, if you like. But the other way to sort of think about that is, Calvino's invisible city as kind of this place of heteroglossia. Yes, I mean, once described, running around Prague, there's an essay, and where you never really find yourself, but you sort of get a sense of being by being lost, and you find something through the process of being lost in the city. So, where the design of urbanity is not producing absolute clarity and organization, even in ecological organization, ecological utopian organization, but certain extent finding yourself or finding sense of being or society in part by being lost. Can this, does this...
it's nice. It reminds me of 2 things, which one can draw in a kind of paratactic or collage-like way.
Yeah.
And that is Wittgenstein's comparison of language to an ancient city. That language itself is not fully codified.
Right.
And it doesn't run in straight lines. But things connect with themselves in certain ways. They make sense at certain times. They may not make sense at other times. But this idea of language structured like an ancient city, in relation to which linguistics is a kind of ideal model, an ideal model of abstract structures.
Sure.
That in a certain sense inform language without ever controlling fully the usage of language, historically, not simply in terms of parole as an instantiation of langue as a structure, but rather differently in terms of more idiosyncratic developments that happen in language and are never entirely predictable, but may make a certain sense, at least retrospectively. That's ancient city language relationship. And then Freud's taking as one of his instances of the return of the repressed, his wandering around, his going to a city he didn't know, and wandering around the city and always coming across the red light district, and then going away for it, going back to his hotel, and then going out again on a different path, and still going through the red light district.
Right. Yeah, so architecture as, or the architecture of the city as kind of this opportunity, or even if you want, a technology to potentially have a way to start working through with your own unconscious in a certain way. You talked about the unconscious as the other within.
Right.
Is another way to think about the purpose of architecture and design, right? I mean,
very much. Yeah,
one can think. What do you think of that?
No, I think that's fascinating. I argue for, both in language and elsewhere in construction, a kind of informed and careful combination of the logical or hypotactic and the paratactic or bricolage like,
Right. Yeah.
rather than simply one or the other. Although there are people who do one or the other who are very, very interesting. And in terms of the paratactic or the segue, Sebald, I don't know if you've read W.G.
I've read
Sebald.
your essay on Sebald. Yes.
But he is very much someone who works in terms of parataxis, I think, without fully realizing it, and who is obsessed by the Holocaust as fascinating a German who exiled himself from Germany, but nonetheless wrote only in German and saw German as his language, and lived in East Anglia, of all places, for 20-something years teaching until he died, and did these journeys across areas, pretty much wastelands in the English countryside that had been stripped bare by industrialization, and saw it in a way, I think, experienced as a kind of non-linear quest. Often walking with his dog, by the way, to discover things. And he has this combination of both the idea of the modern world as ruins, which is again very Benjaminian as well. That he said that when he was young and coming from Germany, that he could never imagine a city that wasn't rubble. Right. So ruins on the one hand, and then enigmatically and in a kind of post-secular manner, having these evanescent moments of epiphany when he saw something, but not something that would usually be taken as out of the ordinary, but something that nonetheless in its sight seemed to him epiphanous, like a duck. And that's sort of fascinating, because you find the same thing in Nabokov, I think. Nabokov sort of much more logical in certain ways, certainly in terms of form, but nonetheless having these moments where something simply arises without expectation. Has a certain valence.
Out of the ruins.
Out of the ruins. And it's interesting that Nabokov is a recurrent figure in Sebald. He often pops up somewhere. And Sebald actually took a trip to Ithaca to visit his uncle in an asylum.
I think that's worth thinking about a little bit more. The idea of ruins and architecture, because of Benjamin, often comes up. But to think of, entire landscapes, cities, just the whole entire edifice, I don't actually want to use that metaphor, the entire sort of work of architecture and urbanism as the assemblage of ruins with some kind of relationship to epiphanic understandings is, I think, an interesting idea. I mean, how would...
it's just fascinating. Like, for us, I think older ruins, even 19th century ruins, can seem romantic.
Yes, sure.
Modern ruins don't seem romantic.
Why not?
I don't know. I mean, I think that since we live through them, they seem to be sinister. They're not seen in a kind of afterglow of nostalgia. There's something you actually have to work with and somehow make do with.
I'm trying to talk about architectural practice in a sense.
I'm talking about the West Side Highway.
sort of building the present or building the future as a kind of ruin reassembly, kind of a rereading of the idea of collage city, through a more critical lens is what I'm trying to widely speculate over here.
And how to reassemble things. The problem with something like a massive skyscraper, I just read this recently, that on some of his buildings, Trump doesn't count certain stories, like 10 to 20, so that when you come out with your floor, the building will seem higher. Isn't that crazy? But that desire for height, which for me is very much related to, in a way, the overdone propensity for excess in the sublime in modern aesthetics. That you want things that are towering, that take away your breath, that leave you speechless, that are somehow analogous to a near-death experience, that those are the things that are very often valorized. And if they're valorized in too one-sided a way, it leads to an incredible tendency for the structure to topple. But it's amazing, you know, including in Trump, I mean, the valorization of excess or the extreme, how extreme vetting, how he loves that word extreme. And that's a little bit scary because you find that in others as well, the desire for extremity, and for things we can't cope with, and the role of the aporia. I mean, there are intractable contradictions or impasses that in some sense you have to confront and come to terms with, but you cannot have that as your telos.
Right. No. So what would be the other, not the other, sort of the another way to think about, let's say, the skyscraper even, or the tall building in a non-sublime way?
Well, first you tear them down to about the 6 floors.
Okay.
Put back some of the old stores that they destroyed in going up.
Right.
Well, I don't know if there is any way to think of them differently except through a kind of hallucination.
Or the big city. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, what struck me in coming out here to the Southwest is that growing up, I think I may have mentioned this before, that growing up in a place like New York, horizon was a totally abstract concept. Right. There is no horizon.
No.
You could stand, you know, by the water's edge and look out, but that's about it. Whereas here, you know, you can look for 50, 60 miles. And, you know, the other thing is, you know, in terms of one's orientation, let's say one's spiritual orientation, if not religious orientation, that I have come to appreciate more the qualities of indigenous religions in contrast to the great monotheisms.
Right.
And it's interesting that even Derrida, really, in his understanding of religion, always talks about the monotheisms.
Right.
Doesn't talk about...
No, for him religion
indigenous.
is the monotheism.
Yes.
When he says theology, he means, right.
Judaism,
Christianity and Islam. Yep.
That's it. The big three. And I think that, you know...
There are some books trying to connect Buddhist ideas to Derrida, aren't there?
Yes, and I think there is this dimension. You know, Derrida has 2 statements that he never tries to bring together. I bring them together, but argue they can't be reconciled. One is that there is no outside the text,
right,
which is, in a way, a notion of imminence,
right,
that everything is connected on an immanent level. Then is the statement that every other is totally other, and as impervious to me as Yahweh, the hidden God. I mean, that's, everything is radically transcendent.
Right.
And, you know, he doesn't, you know, Catholicism tried to bring them together, not in a way that's absolutely intelligible, but that God is both immanent and transcendent. But I think that the idea of immanence and situational transcendence, that is to say, you try to get beyond a situation which you criticize in certain ways, and it is situationally transcendent towards a more desirable possibility. But otherwise, I think that spirituality is a form of immanence whereby you valorize certain things in your environment, where certain things are sacred, and that puts a limit to drilling, evacuation, building, that there are certain limits, that there is a sense of limits that imbues the world. You're not simply projecting a sense of limits on the world, but you are situated within a network in which there are limits that you recognize as limits.
Right.
And the problem
and you are this sort of situational sacredness, if you like. You think this is an attribute identifiable with the non-monotheistic
I think that the indigenous religions may have some idea of a higher being, but it's very vague. And Levi-Strauss points out that in one tribe that he discusses, they have some idea of this higher being, but their only concern is that he leaves them alone. Which makes sense. No, I mean, you know, I still lend some credence to Weber's Protestant ethic book. That is to say, that what happened with a certain Christianity has both the immanent and the transcendent tendencies.
Right.
And it has probably the most powerful and fascinating figures are those who stress radical transcendence in the hidden God. Right. Augustine, Paul, Kierkegaard, and others. Yeah. They are the most, in a sense, powerful, fear and trembling type figures. On the other hand, like even Badiou, who takes Paul as a guide, I mean, do you really want as your guide a lobotomized fanatic? Which, in essence, Paul was. No, but I mean, seriously, the Weberian argument that, in a sense, what happened with a certain turn in Christianity towards radical transcendence is that all the sacred in the world was gathered up and placed out of sight, so that it left this world open to every conceivable form of exploitation.
That's right.
And you have that. I mean, that's what you have in that's basically the message of rampant capitalism and analogous economic systems.
Right. And as we move towards the end here, Dominick, can one think of parsing, this huge ecological turn in architecture and urbanism and in life in general, as a way to recover and rethink our relationship to the let's say the sacredness in nature in a more situational strategic way? Do you think that that's a good epistemological sort of pathway?
Yes, very much so. And that the realization that you cannot have betterment for human beings, and you really cannot put forward economic arguments, as I think Bernie Sanders justifiably did, without having that broader ecological context. That these things have to be situated ecologically, and also in terms of the impact on the rest of nature of what we do.
Right.
And so there is something inherently upsetting, if not sacrilegious, about fracking and drilling and what have you,
right.
and the with the effects in earthquake. Oklahoma now, from having one of the fewest incidences of earthquakes now, has the highest.
Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, and there, one can really make the argument that is sacrilegious.
Yes.
Not only because of somehow it's going to diminish property values or upset the fragile ecology of the water, but just in a sense, it's disrespectful.
Yes, you're screwing around with Mother Nature.
Right. And that's not a good idea.
Not a good idea.
Not a good idea.
Yes, I'll tell you one little story, an anecdote from my youth. I was about 11 years old. I was growing up in Brooklyn, and we're outside with our kids, and one of these kids started to tell us how babies were made. And this is a true story, as they would say in The Godfather.
Right. Do I need to do an advisory warning here?
I stopped, looked at this kid, and I said, "Are you saying that about my mother?" And I punched him. Which again was going a bit too far. Well,
let's not go too far. It's been great talking to you, Dominick. Thank you so much for inviting me into your home and for having this conversation with me.
Very good. I appreciated it.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. I'm Vikram Prakash, and our show's producer is Sadie Wechsler. See you next time.